Alright, welcome back to the channel. I'm going to show you how to super lock down and secure Firefox. So we're going to jump right into it. So I'm working on a fresh install of Firefox here. The first thing we want to do is from your settings tab, go to general, and we're going to scroll down to almost the bottom. So the first thing, I'm just going to point this out. There's an option here by default that's selected to play DRM controlled content. Now, this is completely up to you whether or not you want to disable this. I don't think it's going to have a huge impact one way or the other. For those who are unaware of what this is, basically, this is something that allows Firefox to play DRM content. So, for example, if you go to YouTube, YouTube has a channel called YouTube Movies, and they constantly rotate, like every month they rotate new movies onto there. But in order to be able to play the movies, you have to be able to play DRM content, basically. That's their way of trying to protect it from getting copied off of there and then people posting it or just storing a copy on their computer. Anyway, that uses something called Google Widevine. Now, for example, if you go to the Brave browser doesn't have any sort of DRM content option enabled by default. So if you go to the YouTube movie channel on there and try to play a movie, it's going to ask you if you want to install the Widevine add-on. With Firefox, with this checked by default, it's able to do that. Now, it uses something called a content decryption module. I believe for Firefox, it's provided by Adobe. Now, the way Firefox does, the way Mozilla set this up is it runs it inside of a sandbox. So in theory, it shouldn't be able to collect anything like your IP address, any sort of sensitive info on your computer. What it is basically going to collect is some sort of a unique identifier for your device. It's got to collect something in order to be able to play the DRM content. So if you want to enable this, that's fine. If you want to go ahead and disable it, it's on by default. If you want to disable it, that's completely up to you. There are certain things, like I said, like YouTube movies. There's probably going to be other streaming sites that might not work if you don't have any sort of a DR or content decryption module enabled. I don't see it being a huge impact to security or privacy one way or the other, just because, like I said, the way Mozilla has set Firefox up is that it runs this inside of a sandbox, so it's not supposed to be able to grab a whole bunch of sensitive info from you. The other thing is you scroll down further on the browsing section. This is at the bottom of the general tab here. Two things you probably want to go ahead and uncheck unless you really like having this stuff anyway. It's more of an annoyance than anything else, is recommending extensions and features. Obviously, there has to be some info collected, figuring out what it is that you're looking at, where you're browsing, all that, in order for Mozilla to be able to recommend stuff. Again, this is more of an annoyance than anything, but also there is some privacy aspect to that. So next we'll go to the home tab here, and we're going to start off here. This is stuff that you can turn on or off if you want. So web search, I usually keep this on. So if you open up a new tab here, this is your web search. Now this is Mozilla's Firefox by default. You're going to have all this garbage loading up here. You've got a bunch of news articles. You've got all these. You've got sponsored links here, which is how Mozilla makes some of their money, which, to be fair, they're giving a free product. I'm not going to hate on them for trying to make some money to keep their service running. And then you can see other stuff here that you can just click on. Now, the way that, for example, that it's set up Pocket is supposed to be encrypted. It's not supposed to share any info about you. So probably not a huge privacy implication there. But the issue with that is it puts bloat on here. Now, if you turn this stuff off, it makes it nice and clean, less garbage to worry about. Next thing, search. A couple things to be aware of in here. By default, Google is the default search engine. So you can obviously change this to something like DuckDuckGo. Go do some Googling if you want to. Take a look at that. Every search provider is going to collect info on you, basically. Now, when it comes to privacy, there are a couple things to be aware of. If you're going to have this provide search suggestions enabled, What that means is that every time you go up here to type something in, let's just type in Quad 9, for example. These are search suggestions, so it's going to show up a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, in order for Firefox to be able to do that, it has to send this, what you're typing, over to Google to get search suggestions. So it is potentially a privacy issue. However, you run into a balance there. Do you want to have to type everything out manually, or do you have to want to figure out what exactly it is that you're Googling without getting some search suggestions? Or are you fine with Google having a little bit of that info? Now, next thing, this is where it starts to get really important. So the first setting here is the enhanced tracking protection. So you can see here, Firefox blocks the following. It talks about stuff like social media trackers, cross-site cookies, tracking content in private windows. Now, something to be aware of, I'm just going to go through some stuff here real quick. Social media trackers, so for example, that would be stuff like, for those of you that have been in the advertising industry, that would be like a Facebook pixel, for example. So if you go to a website and there's a Facebook pixel enabled, and then you go to another website and it wasn't blocking any sort of social media trackers or cross-site cookies or anything like that, the Facebook pixel will be able to see what you're doing on all those other websites, and then it kind of feeds all that data back into the pixel, which the person on that original website can then run ads. They can do like retargeting campaigns. This whole big thing, I'll go into a video on it later. It's going to go out of the purview of this video. So that's what social media trackers are, cross-site cookies. Sort of a similar concept. If you go to one website and it's trying to track your cookies, and you go to another website, then, without this, they can see what it is that you're browsing through, tracking content, similar stuff. Crypto miners, fingerprinters. I'll cover fingerprinting some more here in just a little bit. Just keep in mind, this is not foolproof. For those of you who are not familiar with fingerprint, again, I'll go into it in more detail later, but it's not foolproof at blocking fingerprinting on here. Now, some of the other people that will set Firefox up like to use the strict option. One thing to keep in mind is that this could break some websites, like if you go to a merchant website and you're trying to pay for a product, or maybe you're trying to put in an email address somewhere to create an account. Every now and then you might run across a website that this breaks. If you do enable this and you notice a website's not working like it's supposed to, this could be the issue if you have this enabled. So whether you do standard or strict, it's not really a huge deal one way or the other, because I'm going to go over some other stuff here to help you get everything all set up. Next thing, there's an option to send websites a do not track signal that you don't want to be tracked. By default, this is set to only when Firefox is set to block known trackers, or you can set it to always. I don't recommend setting it to always for a couple reasons. First of all, this is voluntary on the websites that it sends the signal to. So even though it may send out a do not track signal, that website could just completely dishonor it and then still track you anyway. The other reason is it's just another piece of telemetry that they can collect, sort of like fingerprinting. So there's not really any point in checking always. Again, I'm going to go over some stuff that'll help block all that garbage. Next thing, cookies and site data. You probably want to make sure you're keeping this cleared at least somewhat often. That way you're not collecting a bunch of stuff, and you've got login credentials if you log into a Google account. And then the same day you're visiting 50 other random websites, it's usually a good idea to clear this stuff out every now and then. You can just click clear data when you want to clear stuff, or you can do Control-Shift-Delete. The other thing that's completely up to you, there's an option here to delete cookies and site data when Firefox is closed. Completely up to you if you want to enable that. It's something, it adds to privacy and security. So for the sake of this video, why not? Next thing, There's an option to save your logins and passwords for websites. Now, Mozilla does have an option to save all this stuff. I personally don't recommend it. What I would recommend is you use some sort of a third-party option. So, for example, a very popular one right now is Bitwarden. Bitwarden is a really good option to save your logins and passwords. So if you're not going to use that, and especially if you don't want all those annoying pop-ups every time you go to log into a website, if you don't want to have to deal with those pop-ups, hey, do you want us to save this on your computer? Just uncheck this garbage. Again, if you're using a password manager, which I strongly recommend, I wouldn't use any of this stuff. It's not nearly as good of an option for multiple reasons as just using a password manager. Similar stuff here, autofill addresses, credit cards. I certainly wouldn't recommend any of this stuff. Just turn it off. You know, just take the extra 10, 20 seconds. If you need to, just take the extra 10 or 20 seconds to fill this stuff in when you need to fill it in. Next thing, history. You can use Firefox, you can use custom settings, you can use never remember history for privacy and security. Obviously, never remember history is going to be your best option, but that could also be a problem if you close out on a window and then you didn't want to leave that website and now you got to go back and type all that stuff in again. The other thing, remember browsing and download history, remember search and form history. Privacy problems, I would recommend unchecking this stuff. Address bar, this is the type of suggestions that will appear in the suggest bar. Kind of comes down to a convenience thing. You know, you can turn some of this stuff off. So suggestions from the web up in the address bar. Do you want to have this stuff on? Do you not? At minimum, I would at least turn off suggestions from sponsors. It's just going to throw out a bunch of garbage. The next thing, coming down into permissions. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here, location, camera, microphone. This is something you need to be really aware of when you're browsing around on the internet. A lot of websites will ask, hey, you'll get a pop-up. Even Google does this if you're trying to search something. And you'll even get this when you go to Google, if you've ever noticed this, when you go to Google to search something, it could be something that has absolutely nothing to do with where you're located or anything like that. But Google will give you a pop-up on their browser saying, hey, we're trying to get your location data. So be aware, if you're going to let stuff access location, camera, microphone, any of that stuff, be aware of what you're clicking allow on. It's the kind of thing that, unless you're going to join some sort of like a Zoom call through a web client as opposed to just using like the Zoom app, for example, obviously it's going to need access to like your camera and microphone. But be really careful what you're giving permissions to, because if you're clicking on like some random website, for example, let's say you go to some random malware website, you're not paying attention, pop-up comes up, hey, they want to access your microphone, and you click allow, that can cause a lot of problems. Next thing, block pop-up windows. This is a good thing to just have enabled. If there is a legit pop-up, you should have an option come up here anyway that will ask, hey, do you want to allow pop-ups? But the days of pop-up websites should be long over, and those that are still doing pop-ups don't have their website set up properly, because there should be none of that garbage. Next thing, warning when websites try to install add-ons. You want to make sure you keep this enabled. Coming down to Firefox data collection and use. This is telemetry stuff that Mozilla collects. So you have stuff like send technical and interaction data Mozilla, make personalized extension recommendations, install and run studies. This is stuff like it's collecting your, how you're using the browser, if your browser crashes, all that kind of stuff. But it's a data collection. Now, we don't want data collection. You can see when you uncheck that, it says you're no longer allowing Mozilla to capture this data. All past data will be deleted within 30 days. I recommend going ahead and removing that stuff. Next thing, security. So this is deceptive content, dangerous software protection. something I'm going to mention on this. You want to make sure you keep this enabled, but this stuff is absolutely not foolproof. This stuff maybe only works maybe 5% of the time, if that. The way this works is if you're browsing around on the internet, let's say you try and type in some sort of a malicious website up in the browser, or you click on some malicious link from search, like Google search, tries to open the website. If it's already in the database of stuff to block, Mozilla will give you a pop-up saying, hey, do you really want to open this website? This is a known malicious website. Problem is a lot of times they can't update it as fast as obviously all the malicious stuff comes out. You could end up going to some website, like a banking website that's been spoofed. So don't rely on this stuff. It's definitely not 100%, but good to go ahead and keep. It's part of the layered approach. You got to have layers upon layers upon layers of security to help protect you. Next thing, HTTPS only mode. I recommend clicking enable HTTPS only mode on all Windows. Just to give you a very brief overview of this real quick, and the vast majority of websites should have HTTPS running. Now, first of all, don't just assume that because a website has HTTPS that it is not infected with malware. HTTPS is basically an encrypted tunnel between when you go to a website, you've got your browser pulled up. I'm going to open up this website here. So I go to uBlock Origin. This is an HTTPS website. So when I connect from my computer to uBlock Origin, all that traffic is going through an encrypted tunnel both ways. Now, if it was an HTTP website, all of this is now plain text. So that's obviously an issue. Like back in the really old days when this stuff wasn't common and you went to put in payment details, let's say you went to a merchant website to try to buy something and it was just an HTTP, that means you're vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle attack. Someone in the middle, an attacker could sit in the middle and see, oh, okay, here's their credit card number, here's their expiration date, all that stuff, and you would never know it because they're just sitting in the middle intercepting all that information going between you and the website. A couple of other things to add on to that. First of all, when you use HTTPS, it's obviously not foolproof when it comes to privacy. Now, for example, let's say your ISP is collecting data about the websites that you visit, which they are. If you're part of the Five Eyes or any of that stuff, basically all these intelligence apparatus collect all this info in bulk. They're a little bit of an exception because they can basically see everything anyway, even if it is encrypted. I'll make a video on that later. But let's say there was someone sitting in the middle trying to look at stuff now, or your ISP. We'll just use your ISP as an example. If you went to an HTTP website, your ISP would be able to see all of that stuff in plain text. They could see all the stuff that you're looking at on the website, all the data in between. They can see all that stuff. With HTTPS, they can see, oh, this person is visiting ublockorigin.com, but they can't see specifically what it is that you're looking at. So HTTPS, super important. This became just a little bit of other info on this real quick. It's also not foolproof because you can do stuff like SSL spoofing. So an attacker could email you a link trying to make it look like your bank, for example, and you click on the link for whatever reason, and you go to the website, and they've spoofed it. They've spoofed the certificate and the address to make it look like it's your actual banking, whoever you do your banking with. But it's actually not. There's also SSL stripping. That's another common attack against SSL encryption. That stuff really gets in the weeds. I'm not going to go over it in this video. This stuff became super popular and really well known after Edward Snowden came out with his leaks. And then it kind of started with the Electronic Frontier Foundation releasing an extension called HTTPS Everywhere, which a whole bunch of people then started installing. and then it just kind of took off from there, where I believe pretty much most any browser out there now will just have the option to turn it on by default. So great option. I recommend just turning that on to HTTPS only mode. Next thing is the secure DNS protection. Now you can really come in here and play around with this stuff. For example, let's just say you turn this off, for example. So use your default DNS resolver. A lot of times this would end up being your ISP's DNS, which you really don't want to use because there's a lot of privacy issues there. It would be super in depth for me to go through all the DNS stuff, but basically it allows your DNS or your ISP to collect even more data about you. Now, the other side to that is people say, well, if you're going to use a third-party DNS provider, then you've got to trust that they're not collecting data on you. So do you want to split having, two parties look at your data, look at the websites you're visiting versus one party? One of the other issues with that is a lot of ISPs can build in content filtering. So there could be a completely legitimate website that you want to go visit, but if your ISP is doing DNS content filtering, then you might not ever see it. You might go to Google it or try to visit the website and it might never load. So it's better to just stick with, you could go with default protection. Again, you're having to place some trust in another entity that they're not going to do anything nefarious with your DNS data. You can come down here and choose increased or max protection, which will give you other options. So you have Cloudflare. They do a lot of data collection. You have NextDNS. Just to give you an example, here's a really good reason to use encrypted DNS. So I pulled up Quad9. Quad9 is a pretty popular secure DNS provider. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole thing on here, but one of the advantages is if you use DNS, I believe Cloudflare does this, I know NextDNS does it, Quad9 does it. They use a lot of threat blocking lists. Now, you could come in here to Quad9 and read this stuff on their website. Basically, they get a lot of their block lists from these threat intelligence sources. You can read all about this stuff here. So it will get this big long list of known malicious websites. So if you have this enabled, let's say, for example, you had Quad9 enabled, by default they have all these block lists built in to help keep out malware. If you go and try to type in, let's say ublockorigin.com were a malicious website. It's not, but let's say that it were, and you have that DNS, the secure DNS through Quad9 on there, and it has that on the block list. It will just block that. So again, it's part of that layered approach that you're going for with keeping stuff secure on your computer. You want to block as much of this garbage as you can. So, like I say, you could either go with the default one, which is Cloudflare, or you could go with like NextDNS. You can also set up custom rules through NextDNS. If you go and create a NextDNS account, you can set up a custom block list on there, for example. Just the preset ones are good. Like if you wanted to use Quad9, for example, you could just use their settings, put that in on the custom option, completely up to you. Now, some other stuff that I want to talk about here is extensions and add-ons. We're going to go into fingerprinting here in just a second. First of all, I strongly recommend using an ad blocker of some sort. The only one that I personally recommend to people is uBlock Origin. Now there's uBlock, there's uBlock Origin. uBlock Origin is the original developer. These projects were forks of each other, and I'm not saying anything bad about uBlock. Personally, I only use uBlock Origin, and it's the only one that I would recommend to other people. I know there was a whole bunch of drama there. going on between people. You can Google it in your free time if you want to. This is the guy that I prefer to stick with. Gorhill is the original developer. This is who I recommend using. So we'll just go ahead and install it real quick, and I'll show you a couple things on here. So we'll go ahead and add to Firefox. There's going to be a pop-up here asking, this extension is going to have permission to access data for all your websites, read, modify privacy settings, access browser tabs. This is a good extension. You can trust this one. Millions of people use it. It's completely legitimate. So you can go ahead and click add. Now, something to keep in mind with this. So first of all, it's a really great extension because it gets rid of a lot of the garbage when you're browsing through websites. You know, you go through Google and you type in, for example, screen recording software, you're going to get like 4 or 5 ads. Instead of, you know, like if you just wanted OBS Studio, you know, you Google that, you're going to end up having like 4 or 5 ads show up for other garbage that you don't want instead of just being able to go straight to OBS Studio. Then there was the thing I mentioned in a previous video that a lot of ad networks spread malware through ads. So that's the other problem. And the other thing is, again, it just makes the browsing experience better. Like if you're on YouTube a lot, all these YouTube ads are absolutely ridiculous. They completely ruin the experience. So it's a lot nicer to just have an ad blocker, so it blocks all that garbage by default. Every now and then you might come up on a website that won't load because you're using an ad blocker and they want you to disable it. Well, you can probably go find that information somewhere else that's not going to be blocked. So definitely get a ad blocker. This adds a ton to privacy and security. The other thing, you don't have to get this. Firefox, this is an official Firefox extension. This is pretty slick. So I'm going to go ahead and add this to Firefox and I'll explain what this does. So an account container, now by the way, technically speaking, you don't really need this because they're tracking protection that we went over in settings earlier. If you go here to privacy and security, enhanced tracking protection, in a way that it's kind of made this stuff not as useful because enhanced tracking protection protects you from having other sources one website be able to track your activity across another website. That was kind of originally the point of having containers in the first place, is you could come up here, let's say you right click on a tab and say, okay, I want to have a personal container. You could right click on a tab, okay, now I want to open up a different container. These containers, so for example, if you go to a website, let's say Facebook, you log into Facebook on this container, and then you go over here to this container tab, which is completely different. By the way, if you open up 2 personal containers, all that information is shared. Now, if you go to a work container, this one's called work, so come over to a different container, then you log into, let's say, your Amazon account. Facebook and Amazon cannot see they cannot do cross-tracking. That was kind of the purpose of using containers in the first place. Now, it's still nice to have this stuff anyway because, you know, let's say you want to log into the same website with a couple different IDs, for example, a couple different email addresses. You could do that. That's one of the options that you have. Obviously, you could use multiple browsers if you want to do something like that, or you can use container tabs. These still do have some use, in my opinion, but with the enhanced tracking protection, it's done away with some of that usefulness. But again, it's nice to have, and plus it's an official Firefox extension, so you don't really have to worry about it being malicious. Now, let's get into fingerprinting on browsers. This covers basically all browsers, not just Firefox. The hot new tracking method now is something called fingerprinting. For those who maybe are unaware, don't fully grasp what fingerprinting is, it builds a profile of you that is it's basically impossible to overcome. There's a new browser coming out now that supposedly can stop that. And then you can use stuff like Tor, which Tor is a pretty good option if you want to try and circumvent that, but then you'd have the other issue, like if you try and log in through your banking website through Tor, there's going to be issues there because you're trying to relay through, let's say the exit node is somewhere and halfway across the world, your bank is going to see that and be like, what the hell are you trying to do here? Someone's trying to hack into your account. But the fingerprinting, so for example, fingerprinters collect a whole bunch of information. So what version, what operating system you're using, what version it is. So for example, Windows 10 32-bit, for example, it can collect that stuff. It will collect the screen resolution. So if you're using a 1080p monitor, that's part of the fingerprinting. Whatever graphics card you're using, that's part of the fingerprint. It will collect all this stuff. And there's other stuff. Here's one of the other reasons that you want to be careful about extensions. Obviously, being able to access all that data is a big deal, so don't just install random extensions, because there's been plenty of extensions that have had malware payloads with them. So don't just go grab any random extension off of the Mozilla store because you don't know whether or not it's going to be legitimate. You need to do your due diligence for whatever extensions you're going to add. But the other thing is, for each extension that you add, that adds to your fingerprint. So let's take all this other stuff out of the equation. Let's take out being able to collect the operating system version. Let's take out being able to figure out what kind of graphics card you're using. Let's take all that out. Let's say you are running a browser. If you already know about fingerprinting, you can skip to the next section. Time codes are down below if you don't want to learn about this. If you don't know about fingerprinting, this is why you got to be careful of this stuff, as it relates to like tracking and privacy and all that. Let's say you have 10 different extensions installed. So you've got uBlock Origin, let's say you're using multi-account containers, and then you come in here and you pick out, I don't know, Simple Translate and Don't Track Me Google and Tab. So Tabby has only 8,000 users. So let's say you pick out 10 different extensions. Now this all goes into fingerprinting. Fingerprinting is borderline impossible to stop collection of, especially in stuff like Chrome, Firefox, Edge. Brave is a lot better at giving you like a generic fingerprint, but you're going to get a pretty, these websites can get pretty detailed fingerprints off of you from using one of these other browsers like Firefox or Chrome. So let's say you've got these 10 different extensions installed. You go to 100 different websites. They're all collecting your fingerprint. Putting the IP address aside, all that stuff, they will all be able to figure out that it's you because that's a very unique fingerprint. Now, when you add in all the other data that they collect, all of the other telemetry stuff, you know, like the graphics card, the operating system version, the desktop resolution, all that stuff. Fingerprinting is it's borderline impossible to work around, and typically the more you try to overcome it, you just start running into a whole bunch of issues with trying to work around it. If you really need to work around fingerprinting, you need to look at using something like the Tor browser. So that's just something to be aware of when it comes to that. All right, one of the last things we're going to talk about here, we're going to start wrapping this video up. Holy shit, 35 minutes in. I didn't think it was going to end up being this long. So there's one other thing that you need to be aware of. It's called a WebRTC leak. So I'm going to go to About Config. This will let me, when you type in About Config, it's going to ask you, changing this can affect Firefox performance or security. Don't just go in here and start changing stuff around at random. But there's something called the WebRTC leak, and I'll explain that to you real quick. So WebRTC is stands for Web Real-Time Communication. So the thing with WebRTC is, if you're doing stuff like video or audio conferencing through the browser instead of through like an official app, you know, like Skype or Zoom or any of that, if you turn this off, obviously that can be an issue with trying to get that stuff to run. But the WebRTC leak because of that communication protocol, this really only applies if you're using a VPN. If you don't use a VPN, you really don't need to worry about this issue. But with WebRTC Leak, if you use a VPN and you don't have WebRTC turned off, let's say you're going to a website, it can actually, because of this protocol turned on and the issue with WebRTC, the way that it's configured, it can leak your real IP address. So if you don't want your real IP address leaked, let's say you're visiting a website that you're trying to hide that you're visiting, but WebRTC leaks your real IP, that can obviously be an issue. This would be more of an issue for like journalists or people that need to avoid this kind of tracking here. So to disable it, type in media.peerconnection. So media.peerconnection.enabled. If you double click this, change it to false, that will disable WebRTC and it will prevent the WebRTC leak. So that pretty much wraps this video up. That covers a lot of stuff. You could get a little more in depth. You could really start going around messing with the about config settings if you wanted to. There's really no point. And again, when it comes to fingerprinting, there's really only so much you can do to secure things before your privacy footprint starts becoming an issue, and then you got fingerprinting coming in and all that. But if you do this stuff with Firefox, you will be a hell of a lot more secured, locked down, and you'll have a lot more privacy than just by the default setting. So that's going to wrap the video up. If you like it, make sure you go ahead and drop a comment down below, leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you hate it, leave a dislike, leave a hate comment. I really don't give a shit. I'm just going to keep pumping videos out anyway. All right, I'll see you in the next one.